This is the Education Gadfly Show.
Welcome to the Education Gadfly Show. I'm Stephanie Disler, here to kick things off for this week's episode. Today, we're joined by Ashley Jochim, principal at the Center on Reinventing Public Education and mom of four, to debate school choice, regulation, and how Democrats' defense of public schools can sometimes leave families behind. Then, on the Research Minute, Adam Tyner highlights a new study on school decentralization in Chicago, showing how giving principals more autonomy over budgets and operations can sometimes boost student achievement. All this and more on the Education Gadfly Show, starting now.
Hello, this is your host, Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, here at the Education Gadfly Show and online at fordhaminstitute.org. And now, please join me in welcoming our special guest for this week, Ashley Jochim. Ashley, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a while since I've been here.
Yeah, well, welcome back. It is great to have you. Ashley is principal, not like school principal, but principal at the Center on Reinventing Public Education, and has been writing some great stuff, including a debate with Mike McShane on regulations and private school choice. And so, as our regular listeners know, we've had Mike on the show recently. I've been talking about this topic. We're looking forward to unpacking that and more with you. First, though, let's welcome my colleague, David Griffith.
Hey, Mike. Hey, Ashley. Always a pleasure.
For those of you watching on YouTube, David has a new computer, and it looks like the camera follows him wherever he goes. So we've told him, no, stop it. We've told him he has to stay perfectly still, like a tranquil pond. So we'll see how he does with that. We'll grade you on that later. Oh, but don't be, stressed out about that, David. We also want you to relax, be yourself, chime in.
I'm always relaxed, Mike.
Oh, yes. Oh, okay, good. That's the West Coaster in you. Ashley's from the West Coast also. And Ashley, so excited to have you on the show. Let's talk, as I said, about regulations in school choice programs. Let's do that on Ed Reform Update. All right, Ashley. Well, you and Mike McShane did have a great debate on Education Next in print over this topic, using Milwaukee as a bit of a case study. Mike was on the show last week, and he made the argument that said, look, of course, we should worry about fraud and people stealing money or starting terrible schools in these private school choice programs. But we need to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, that if we go overboard on regulations, then we can stifle innovation. And he, in fact, referred to Stephen Breyer's 1982 book, where Breyer wrote about how it's relatively easy to get rid of 90% of the pollution in a river. That last 10% that's hardest, and where you start to hit some real trade-offs. So it is with school choice and the notion of trying to regulate. So I'm curious what you think about that. And are we at that point? Are we actually getting 90% of the fraud or the bad schools out of the way already in school choice land?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know that we actually know the answer to that last question, in part because there's so little journalistic reporting on what's happening on the ground in places like Arizona and Florida. But my guess is the answer is that balance is not quite right, at least in some of the states that have expanded private education choice. And I would point to Arizona and Florida actually as two places that are where the balance is sort of off kilter in important ways. And I think that's problematic in part because those have become the national models, right? So the regulatory landscape around choice obviously varies dramatically. If you go to Indiana, private schools are required to participate in the state test, just like public schools. It looks very different if you go down to Arizona or east to Florida. And those are the sort of national models that have been advanced by advocates in state legislatures around the country. So if you look at Texas, what does Texas's legislation look like? It's modeled after Florida's, it's modeled after Arizona's. So I think that's really important. Look, Mike and I agree. I think Mike McShane and I agree on a lot of this. And I love that he brought up Stephen Breyer's book. I think I told you, Mike, that I once started a talk at AEI with the proclamation that policy doesn't improve schools, people do. I think it's really important. We can't engineer school improvement. We can't engineer really, great schools. But there's a big difference between saying, there's some limitations on what we can accomplish with regulation and doing what they've done in the context of Arizona and Florida, which is basically very little in terms of trying to protect consumers from potential harm. And look, what I always tell people is markets aren't magical, right? How well they work depends on whether consumers are able to hold businesses and people off, selling their wares accountable. That's tricky in education for a lot of different reasons that we could get into. But to me, I think in the end, where I stand on regulation is there's a lot government can do to help consumers get more of what they want. And that's ultimately, I think, what everybody wants on this issue.
Well, and at least in Florida, they do require the participating schools to test students, right? They get to choose which test. I believe the results have to go to the parents. Now, I mean, most schools probably already are using something, the STAR, the iReady, MAP, something. And so they make sure they give that to participating students. It goes to parents. At least there's some information. Arizona does not require that. That's a big problem. But think about Milwaukee. I mean, it seemed like from your article in Education Next, you described how over the long course of the Milwaukee school choice program, first in the nation, a whole bunch of bad schools opened up and got public money and served kids for a while and then closed down. And so, is it that the opening up was a failure? The closing down was a failure? Or was it a success? I mean, look, we allowed innovation to happen, but eventually these schools did close, even though there was no forcing mechanism, perhaps like we have in the charter school world with authorizers.
Yeah, I mean, you could look at what happened in Milwaukee and think, well, this is the course of the market working itself out. I think we can do a lot better than that. And I think there's good motive for doing a lot better than that. So for those who didn't read the article, the vast majority of new start schools in Milwaukee did close over the course of the history of the voucher program. Most of the schools operating in that voucher program today are century-old institutions, mostly Catholic and Lutheran schools. So I think Milwaukee raises really interesting questions about how much, first of all, how much of that churn was productive in terms of actually delivering things that consumers and families want. And I think also just the theory of action around is the problem in education is we actually need to we need to try a bunch of new stuff and then figure out, what sticks to the wall. I think Milwaukee shows that maybe that's not true. The schools that are most in demand are actually using very traditional time-tested methods that families are attracted to because they work. So I think that's one piece of the puzzle. When you look at, I want to follow up on the case of Florida, because you mentioned the testing requirement there for private schools. And this was also the case. It was wrapped into the legislation in Texas that recently authorized universal private school choice. That requirement in Florida has been so ineffective. And the reason why is because it requires growth data. So for listeners who aren't familiar with this, basically schools are required to administer a nationally norm referenced assessment. So these are, and then you're comparing growth over time. So what does that require? Well, it requires 2 data points, year 1 and year 2, to calculate a growth score. And then it requires a minimum sample size. So in Florida, I think it's 30 students is what's reported. If you have fewer than 30 students, that's not reported. So I have pored over the evaluation reports in Florida, which are publicly available for anyone who wants to go down the rabbit hole like I have. And what you can see there is the vast majority of schools participating in Florida's program do not report any data on educational outcomes. Well, why is that? That's because about 60% of kids, at least prior to universal expansion, 60% of kids who go into Florida's private school choice program exit within 2 years. So year one, year two, they're gone, So I think advocates have misunderstood like the power of that data to drive the marketplace. I think there's a lot more we could be doing with Florida's data, even with all the gaps that exist, right? Like, I mean, if somebody could take that data and make it publicly accessible in a parent guide, I would cheerlead that effort, because there are operators that are taking advantage of families, and those families are leaving. They eventually learn what they've bought is not very good, and hence why they head to the exits. But shouldn't we prevent families from having to, live through experience those mistakes? No,
that's really interesting in Florida. I did not realize that. And the word churn, again, it's so much churn. So David, what do you think? I mean, should we figure out a way on the private school side, especially for new schools, right? I mean, Ashley's saying, look, if you're talking about a 100-year-old Catholic school, Lutheran school, it's, maybe you don't worry about this as much, but a new school pops up in a storefront, and we figured out in the charter world that some of those schools were fraudulent. Some were good. You needed to have a mechanism to figure out which was which. I mean, we need that in the private school choice world too, or is that getting into Mike McShane's 10% problem? You're going to squash some things that might be innovative.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably my biggest source of frustration is the manner in which the fairly compelling lessons that have emerged from the charter school experience seem to just be ignored when we move over to private school choice. I know there are people who want to argue that these are two different things, but they're really not. The market for schools is the market for schools. It has some identifiable features, whether you're talking about traditional public schools or charter schools or private schools. Parents are looking for similar information. They want to know, are kids learning? They want to know what the curriculum is about. They want to know about discipline. I mean, they want to know a lot of things. I think that's one of the challenges. I think it's very hard to look at the charter school experience and argue that we shouldn't worry about bad providers. I think part of the challenge for everybody in this conversation is that it's hard to see all the way to the end of it, right? So, we're so often dealing with markets that are just still really emerging. And I think one thing I've learned in the past decade is that process is really, really slow. And so it can sometimes be a little unfair to judge the regulatory regime based on what happens in the first 3 to 5 years, because schools are created very slowly. They disappear slowly. It's not, it's not like AI where there's a new model that comes out every few weeks. I don't sense a lot of appetite for compromise coming from the other side of this debate, but nevertheless, I actually think there is room for compromise. I think we could have some flexibility, for example, when it comes to assessments. I think if a state wanted to present like a bouquet of assessments that it was confident that it could sort of align and norm and turn into a growth score that families could use, to make apples to apples comparisons. I think there's a lot of scope for that. I think it does require two to tango, though, right? We need some acknowledgement from the folks who believe in innovation and who believe or just who believe in parental prerogatives and in decentralization, that there are trade-offs here, and that we have an obligation to families and to students to make sure they get a good education. So that's my main thing is, you're not innovating if kids aren't learning to read. I don't know what the right word is for it, but that's not innovation. Isn't some catch-all term that we can apply to anything that's done differently. It needs to be coordinated.
And I don't think Irish Mike, as we call him,
I don't think he is,
would disagree with that. But it is, it's tough. It's tough. And look, you see this in higher ed, for example, this question about, hey, what is it going to take for the University of Austin to get accredited so it can start receiving federal financial aid, right? There's concern that the typical accreditation people are so beholden to the existing universities that they want to make that process ridiculously hard. on the flip side, there's been a lot of diploma mills in higher ed. So you want there to be some guard. It's hard. It's trade-offs. Let's turn a little bit, Ashley, to this comment that you've made to me personally, and I'd love for you to talk more about it, which is, what do you do if you're the Democratic Party on education? You have the kind of concerns we've talked about today when it comes to private school choice, although often it's just expressed as we're against it, period. And it often then sounds like the Democrats are just defending the traditional public schools as it is. Like, what can the Democrats do to indicate that they understand that the public schools do need reform?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite topics these days, and it's probably because our politics are so depressing on the national stage. So they provide reminders of the opportunities for leadership that exist for anyone who can kind of take advantage of this chaos to present a real platform to move the country forward. So my take on all of this, I want to just set the stage a little bit. And I think there's been a lot of voices in this space. Democrats for Education Reform, for example, came out with a push for Democrats to embrace private school choice vouchers as part of their platform. And the rationale for that position was that, look, parents want choice. And so you're not going to win back voters unless you sort of, meet voters where they are, which is that they want choice. My take on this is I think we've misdiagnosed what parents actually want. And I speak to this as a mom of four who talks to other parents, but also I think this position is supported by survey data, by longstanding experience in cities with lots of choice through deployed, whether publicly financed or not, right? Seattle, where I'm located, 30% of kids go to private school without any public subsidies. So one of the highest rates in the nation. So there's lots of choice happening. And when you talk to parents on the ground, right, I think we underappreciate the cost of choice. Most moms I know, what they want is a school that's convenient to home, that does its job, teaches their kids how to read and do math, and keeps them safe and, free from bullying, right? These are real basics in the context of schooling. Most parents, in my experience as a researcher, when I've interviewed families, when I've surveyed them, they turn to choice as an escape valve, right? They're escaping an otherwise desperate situation. They're not turning to it because they really love choice. And my kids have attended private schools. It is a slog transporting your kids to and from school miles away, then trying to arrange play dates, 30 minutes from your home. Like, most parents want convenience. In the end, right? We all have, our lives are crazy and chaotic. We don't want to be reinventing the wheel just to get our kids educated. So with that in mind, my thoughts on where the Democrats could really go is, whether they embrace choice or not, that's probably a state by state issue on whether that's a need. But we need a platform for improving schools, public schools, because that's where the majority of kids are. That's where more kids would be for convenience sake if they were doing the basic things that parents expect them to do. Provide, a good education and keep their children safe while they're in those four walls.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, Ashley. And we did a big focus group / survey project over a decade ago where we were digging into, as we said, what parents want. And we tried to do these new methods that could get, beyond the headlines, really dig in and see if there were different groups, maybe different niches out there. And we did find some, but they were niches. They were, small. The vast majority of parents, and Bill Jackson, who used to run great schools, told me this is what we were going to find. He was exactly right. Something like 80% of the parents just wanted what you said. They just want good schools. And they define that in a very sort of, traditional way. And so I think there is something to it. And now, of course, there's parents out there that want that good school to also be religious. That's something that you can't get in the public schools, at least not yet. Thank you, Supreme Court. So that is something that some parents want. But I think that that's true. And if you're not speaking to the frustration of parents some of whom are having a hard time just finding a good school near their home, then you're losing them. You buy that, David?
Yeah, I do. And I was just going to say, I'm going to take off my school choice hat here for a second and just agree. I recently found the time to finally read Abundance, right? You know what does not appear anywhere in that book?
Yeah, education.
Yeah.
It's kind of staggering, right? Like it's generally, I mean, I'm not an expert in these areas of policy, but it seems very coherent and lucid, and I didn't buy every word of it, but it's interesting. But mostly when it comes to these other areas of policy, it's there. There are chapters on energy and transportation and housing that one can find and agree with or disagree with. You cannot find a chapter on education. And I don't know. I don't really feel any particular need to single out the authors, but it's indicative of something much deeper in with my side of the aisle, which is it's just incredibly frustrating to me. I mean, simply saying that in addition to defending public schools, we're going to do something about their quality, or we're going to try, since it's harder than it sounds, would be a massive step forward right now. It just simply at the level of the signals it sends about who we're serving and what we care about. I'm not running for public office, but lots of people are, and they should think about it.
Right. We want an abundance of good schools. Yeah.
I'm so glad you brought that up, David, because I have made, when that book first came out, there's lots of chatter on social media about we need an abundance agenda for education. And I just kept going, the issues are totally different. Yes, we have a supply problem, but it's not about we need, every parent wants 100 choices. Again, choice is hard. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with Daniel Willingham. He's a cognitive psychologist who has written a lot about education. But his book, Why Don't Students Like School? And the point he starts out in that book making, right, is that we don't like to think, I think choice requires thinking. You have to go research it. You have to go, you're going to school visits, all of this kind of stuff. It's an incredibly demanding job. And most people would rather spend their time doing something else if they could, if they just had a good default option. And the good news is, the current status of public education is there's so much room for improvement. And I think we've really taken the wrong lessons from the reform era, that reform is too hard, that we can't do anything that'll move the needle unless we, reinvent the social safety net. I think there's a lot of room for growth. And Emily Hanford recently profiled that Ohio school, that has almost universal literacy rates in third grade. The science of reading, I think, is a really good place where you can see some of this happening. But there's so much more like that in the context of schools. And I'm just speaking from my own kids' experiences. I went to complain to the dean of students at my daughter's middle school a few months ago about, just some inappropriate behavior she was being subjected to at school. And the dean of students was basically like, what can we do? And I suspect I'm not the only one out there, right, that's getting this kind of indifference from administrators around troubling behavior at school, bullying, all of these kinds of things. These are the pressures that send families to the exits, whether they have public dollars or not, And I say that because that's what I was ready to do. Except my daughter wouldn't. She wouldn't. She didn't want to leave her friend, so it wasn't going to happen. But we can do so much more than we're doing now, and it just starts with acknowledging the problems, the real problems that kids and families are struggling with every day in these classrooms.
All right. Well said, Ashley. We will leave it there. Ashley Jochim, principal at the Center on Reinventing Public Education. Thanks for coming. Make sure to check out the great things Ashley has been writing over at Education Next, among other places. Ashley, we'll got to get you back on the show sometime again soon.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me.
All right. Now it's time for everyone's favorite Adams Research Minute. Adam, welcome back to the show.
Great to be back, y'all.
All right. I have to say congratulations to your Oklahoma Sooners over your big victory over Michigan on Saturday night.
Yeah, it was a good game.
I gotta say, your team looks very good. You hate to lose a game, but at least I felt like it wasn't so much that Michigan played poorly as Oklahoma played really well. Both that amazing quarterback you've got, who is very impressive, and your defense, man, they're just super fast. So I was thought that you guys should be in the top 10 for sure by now, but somehow the nation's college football coaches seem to think they know more than I do about this sort of thing.
Well, I appreciate all of that. We'll see how things look at the end of the season. I think you guys have to play one more ranked team by the end of the year, and I think we have to play like 8 or 9 more. So y'all might have a significantly better record when it comes down
It's
to
got
it.
to be more than that for us, isn't it? Well, I don't know. We've got 5 or 6 teams in the Big Ten that are ranked. So it is true we don't play Penn State every year anymore. So which is crazy and
I
disappointing.
think currently Ohio State is the only team that you
Maybe
have
that's
left on your schedule, but these things will probably change over time.
All right. Well, speaking of things that change, education research, it's always changing. What we think we know about certain topics, always changing.
Yeah.
And here's a topic that we're going to talk about today, decentralization, which, what do we think we know about it? I don't know, but let's hear the newest. How's that for a
segue? Yeah, I love that.
Smooth as butter.
Yeah, we are going to be talking about decentralization. It's kind of a heady question of political institutions and, what are the consequences for how schools work. And in this case, we're talking about like how much autonomy we ought to give to principals to run their schools, or should principals mostly just be focused on implementing policies that are determined at the district level? And then what happens when you actually give school principals more autonomy? So to better understand those questions, this new study by Northwestern University economist Kirabo Jackson examines the Independent School Principals Program, or ISP for short, which let principals in Chicago public schools make more of their own decisions about staffing, budgets, and school priorities. First, let me say a word about that program, which started in 2016. Instead of having staffing, budgets, and key instructional decisions all dictated from the central office, ISP principals are treated more like the CEOs of their schools. They receive a salary supplement, they commit to staying at their current school for at least 2 years, and are expected to use their increased authority to make resource, personnel, and scheduling decisions that are tailored to their students' needs. That might mean reassigning specialist teachers into core classrooms to shrink class sizes, or reallocating funds towards bilingual education or counseling, or adjusting curricula and schedules. It's also worth mentioning how schools got into the ISP program. This wasn't a blanket district policy, it was targeted. Only schools led by principals with strong prior evaluations and solid student outcomes were invited, and participation was voluntary. To evaluate the ISP program, the paper uses data from all Chicago elementary schools from 2009 to 2019 and compares changes in outcomes before and after the program, which was implemented in 68 elementaries, to changes in a matched control group of schools over the same period. They used detailed administrative data on passing rates, principal evaluations, school demographics, turnover, and even some granular personnel spending metrics. What the study finds is that for the vast majority of principals, the ISP program improved outcomes. On average, schools led by ISP principals saw student test scores rise by about 8% of a standard deviation, which is a small but still meaningful gain. Beyond test scores, the ISP schools also reported stronger school climate ratings from teachers and students, smaller average class sizes, and lower principal turnover. But the benefits were not evenly spread. Principals who had stronger prior performance, those with high leadership ratings and good past results, those are the ones who saw the biggest gains when given more autonomy. Weaker principals, by contrast, sometimes made decisions that would hurt achievement, and that suggests that more freedom isn't always better if the leadership capacity is low. Schools with distinctive student populations also benefited more. Outlier schools, those with unusually high shares of English learners or students with disabilities, or very different demographics from the district norm, those are the ones who saw the strongest ISP effects. The study also probed some of the mechanisms, and I've already mentioned a little bit of this, but one of them was stability. Principal turnover dropped sharply in the first year of the intervention. Remember, they signed that 2-year kind of contract, and continued even after that 2-year commitment had expired. Another mechanism was school climate. On surveys, both teachers and students rated ISP schools as significantly better learning environments with an effect size large enough to plausibly explain some of the achievement bump. Resource allocation offered additional evidence. Overall spending didn't increase, but class sizes dropped by more than one student per class, suggesting that principals restructured staff and schedules to some extent. In schools with many bilingual or special education students, spending shifted towards those areas, pointing to a more targeted use of resources by the principals. The bottom line is nuanced. Granting autonomy to principals isn't a silver bullet, but when you give it to effective leaders, especially in schools with unique needs, it can raise student achievement. I'll end with this. The ROI here was especially noteworthy. Remember that this intervention was almost free. No extra resources went into these schools. So to me, that makes those modest positive effects on student learning really seem even better.
Wow. Yes, I like it a lot, Adam. Let me ask you one question on the methodology. So I understand that among the principles that have been chosen, you're comparing some that were more or less effective and impressive on the front end. But then the ones that weren't chosen, like in the control group, did they have some impressive principles in that control group too? Or it just seems like it's so hard to make a control group. If you're being selective, I don't see how you kind of control for the fact that, these schools are run by people that are really good principals.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Mike. And it's something that he works to try to develop a very similar observationally equivalent control group. And remember, this is just 68 elementary schools in this giant district. So there were a lot to pick from there. But you're right that there are some of these selection things that, you have to believe that they do get them matched so that they look like observationally equivalent. And then you're also comparing the introduction of the ISP. You're comparing the school to itself, right? So it's a change in the school itself and then comparing that to the matched group. Okay. So it is, you're right that there's selection going on. I think they're dealing with it about as well as you could.
I guess what I mean is there weren't principals that should have qualified, but they were like, well, I'm sorry, you didn't get picked because we need you in the control group.
There's a couple things going on. So that didn't happen explicitly, but first of all, they didn't all get introduced at the same time. Okay. So we're seeing this phased in over a few years. And so different schools are getting picked at different times. It's also a function of not just the principal quality, but also the past performance of the school. And then not all the schools participated, even if they met all the criteria. So there are comparison schools out there for them to leverage.
Look, I mean, sometimes people have called this earned autonomy, and I think it makes sense. I mean, especially in the traditional public school sector, the fact that it's selective matters a lot. You would think, right? When people have tried to do this without that, well, guess what? Some principals don't have the know-how, or what some people might call capacity, to make good decisions. And then the experiment tends to fail. And then we overcorrect by having the central office come down and run everything. So
their results kind of suggest that maybe they set the bar a little too low, right? Because the effects were strongest for the strongest of that subset of principles that were already kind of
that's interesting. So maybe that's important, right? That maybe earned autonomy is good, but let's be honest, it's not going to be a ton of principals maybe who can take advantage of it. David?
Yeah, I guess I don't disagree with anything you guys said, but I think the part that I'm struggling to wrap my head around is autonomy as opposed to what, right? Like if we're saying autonomy isn't always good, right? Or, can be abused, right? So what are we saying is the alternative to that, right? And I think we're saying it's something like the accumulated wisdom of district central offices or something like that, right? Or just kind of like received wisdom about how a school should be run, right? Is actually not so bad, right? Or it's not so bad that you can't do worse if you kind of experiment without a lot of internal capacity. Is that a fair summary? Because I mean, everybody needs some autonomy, right? Or they have some autonomy, just as a practical matter, right? But we're saying here that for some individuals who are in charge of schools, autonomy is a double-edged sword. And so I buy that, but I guess I think it's interesting to ask, so what? So what are we saying is better than that? And how are we characterizing that?
Yeah, and especially in a large traditional public school system. I mean, I've had this debate with people who really are excited about the portfolio model, so to speak, where they say, hey, Chicago public schools, they should treat all their schools like charter schools. And my take has always been, I mean, maybe way back when I thought that was promising, and then it just never seemed to work. And it was partly because these big districts, it's hard for them to do this. They don't have the culture, the politics. My argument is instead, hey, let them lean into just trying to be a really good school district where, yeah, you make most of the decisions in central office and then the principals are middle managers. And this is an interesting wrinkle. Hey, if you've got some really good principals, yes, let those ones make more decisions. That to me sounds more of a plausible theory of action, especially if you make good decisions in the central office, like pick the right curriculum and spend your money on the right stuff, than on this idea that suddenly we're gonna give you the authority that you would have in the charter school sector, except not really, because there's this teacher union contract and all these other rules that really get in the way. You know what I'm saying?
I know what you're saying. I guess I'm also not totally convinced that we've unpacked autonomy versus support here, right? Like, to me, the question is, so if these principals, if they aren't doing well, why would you ever be doing worse than you were doing otherwise? That's what I don't understand here, right? Like, you have the district there. No one is forcing you to deviate from its practices, right? You presumably can draw on the district's resources, its curriculum recommendations, its ability to replace difficult students, yada, yada, yada. I guess I'm trying to understand what role the district is actually playing in the case of these schools that are not doing as well. Because I don't know if I do agree, Mike. I mean, I feel like ideally we would give people autonomy, and then this is how I like to be managed, right? When I need help, I can go to someone and say, hey, I appreciate all this autonomy. I'm a little over my head here, right? Can you perhaps help me with this thing? And I feel like surely that's the model that every organization should be aspiring to, right? Is, we're giving you the autonomy that you need to exercise your good judgment and the support you need when you feel, like you're a little overwhelmed. And I guess I just don't understand why the principals in this context weren't able to take advantage of that second element.
You mean the weaker principals?
Yeah. I mean, if it's not going well, go back to what you were doing or reach out for help or something. I mean, in many ways, it's more intuitive to me that a standalone charter school would sink beneath the waves than that a sort of standalone, traditional public school that is still embedded within a district would somehow struggle. It seems like there should always be a safety net there if you need it.
All right. Well, I think we will leave it there. Adam, a very interesting study. And I got to say, Carabo Jackson, always one of my favorites. He does amazing work. So check it out. All right, folks. That is all the time we've got for this week. So until next week.
I'm David Griffith.
And I'm Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, signing off.
The Education Gadfly Show is a production of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, located in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit us online at fordhaminstitute.org.